Testing. 1, 2, 1, 2. Red leather, yellow leather. Red leather, yellow leather. The magic monkeys mingle in the midst of the marketplace. Alright, we're good. Welcome to part 2. Welcome to part 2 of this little mini-series I'm doing, bringing attention to the very informative and eye-opening book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon by David McGowan. And the first part I was this whole series I'm just skimming over what goes deeper into the book, but just main points that affect us going into today, and how as striving musicians and artists, people think that this illusion is the end goal and the holy grail of their fruits, but it turns out that it's a machine for the most part, and people really only get into the machine if they're willing to become a part of that machine, and that involves doing naughty things. So I wanted to start this one off with a couple just interesting factoids, a couple of interesting facts from the book, such as being a log cabin where many parties and gatherings were held inside of the canyon for highly influential people. And who lived in that house for a while? Frank Zappa, whose father was basically a chemical warfare engineer. He experimented with chemicals and worked for the military, working on groundbreaking biowarfare techniques, which seems pretty relevant now, doesn't it, with all these pseudo diseases and all of these random viruses that come out of nowhere and have their controlled effects, it seems, leading into how Ratatouille Fauci and his crew, with the gain of function research in China, where the COVID hoax originated, with this whole bat biting a snake or whatever in the marketplace. I remember the story, but it's just so silly that I don't even care to recall it accurately. This gain of function research, what are they doing? Isolating these viruses and slowly letting them loose on different populations, causing the scare. There's so many movies about it too, like World War Z with that boy Brad Pitt, where at the end there's a man, it started with like a bite, and then it spreads out through the rest of the world. The next person who inherited this log cabin from Frank Zappa was Animals singer Eric Burdon. Eric Burdon, who was supposedly just the next ringleader of this cult. Zappa had named his kids like Moonchild and like Bebop. He named his kids some crazy things, and he raised these kids without formal education, which isn't a bad thing, but it's also like what is he teaching these kids as they grow up in this scene? And now they're on their own, doing their own things. I think some of them are musicians now, and they still probably have ties to this occult side of the music industry. Fake kidnapping of Frank Sinatra Jr. was a big thing. Was a big detail that I was like, what? I didn't even hear about any of this. The kidnapping of Frank Sinatra Jr. to cover up the Dealey Plaza, which it was where JFK was assassinated. It was to cover up the heat on that by causing another incident, diverting the attention from what was really going on, sort of creating a mass panic, such as, variants of the virus, Omicron, Delta, inflation, people losing their jobs. It's just hitting from all different sides, trying to create an agitated public, in my opinion. Terminal Island coming back again. Graham Parsons was sent to Terminal Island, who was in the Byrds, and a couple other bands. I believe the Flying Burrito Brothers Another example of someone who didn't have a lot of talent but had a lot of rise instantly in the scene. Going into that Terminal Island jazz with Timothy Leary was also there, but one that I was waiting to get to, a Mr. Owsley Stanley. They called him Bear. He was a genius audio engineer for the Grateful Dead and was a clandestine secret chemist, which is what clandestine means. A clandestine chemist is someone that isn't working for any company, or what they mean by it is they're not operating ethically. They could basically cook up whatever drugs they want. And this guy was an LSD chemist and also developed STP, which is a research chemical of LSD, which is where we see all these different variants of drugs coming out, research chemicals that send people to the hospital and give him permanent psychological damage. Point is Owsley Stanley, the Bear, was a big LSD chemist for the counterculture movement. He was the first known mass producer of the drug, and he was also part of the development of the Wall of Sound, which Phil Spector has coined as well. He was known as the Acid King. I bring this up now because he brought the drugs over to be tested at Frank Zappa's log cabin. And they had these wild parties. The mamas and the papas. Mama Cass was known to be a wild gal. She was also known as the Earth Mother of the Laurel Canyon. And she was a big bosom for gathering parties and promoting these drugs. And it's funny how Frank Zappa is the testing ground for this place, coming from a line of chemical warfare engineering background, which his father was involved in. Owsley's grandfather, Augustus Owsley Stanley, governor of Kentucky, and campaigned against Prohibition in the 1920s. Some nice family ties on what they've been about as the Stanley family, which anti-prohibition, keep that alcohol flowing, keep the people dumb, keep the people sedated, baby. Owsley III, which is the one I'm talking about with the LSD chemist, served in the Air Force as an electronics specialist. So, fun fact that he was an audio engineer, worked as an electronic specialist in the Air Force. So, who knows what kind of training he has. As we know now, this music is harmonics. It's frequencies that affect the subconscious, the unconscious mind, and that's why we feel such emotional ties to the music, which can be used for good or bad, arguably. You know, there's beautiful music that can be used for healing, music that portrays a memory or a smell. That's why you get blasted back to a specific memory when you listen to a specific song. Owsley's laboratory was raided by police on February 21st, 1965, and he beat the charges and sued to have his lab equipment returned, which is hilarious because LSD wasn't illegal at the time. He literally beat the court case after they found an insane amount of LSD in there, and he sued to get his equipment back to keep making it, and it worked out. He was held at Terminal Island from 1970 to 1972. So he has the Terminal Island tie as well. Other people, as I've mentioned before, Charles Manson, Tim Leary, Al Capone, they were all held at Terminal Island for a time. Keith Moon of The Who and Mama Cass died in the same flat in England, supposedly, which McGowan, not sure how to pronounce it, who's the author of the book, alludes to the fact that they knew too much, so they both got zapped at this flat. And Mama Cass's death is famous for her choking on a ham sandwich because she was fat, but, you know, like died of heart failure as well. Like, it's unclear, but it seems, you know, she could have been messed up on drugs and choked on a sandwich, but I mean, it kind of sounds like a mockery of her in the long run, you know, just like the perfect cover-up. Janis Joplin's dad was a petroleum engineer for Texaco. Janis Joplin, of course, 27 Club. She lived a mile east of Laurel Canyon, an early part of her career. And Ronald Newman of the Grateful Dead, the Zodiacs, Warlocks, had a short relationship with Joplin, who also died at 27 from a gastrointestinal hemorrhage, which I guess it could happen, but he's part of the 27 Club, had ties with Joplin, Grateful Dead, and it seems like in this machine, at a certain point, you can either go with the madness, go with the Satanism, or you get turned into a lunatic or killed in some fashion, whether it be drugs or literal homicide. Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, Amy Winehouse, Kurt Cobain, you've heard of the 27 Club. They all have and most of them have mysterious circumstances behind their deaths. The Allman Brothers, son of Willis Allman, U.S. Army Sergeant. They were originally called the Allman Joys, which I think is really funny. Willis Allman, the father of the Allman Brothers, was murdered by another officer, which is interesting. And I invite you to look deeper into that and read the book to get further details, because I got to move on. Jimi Hendrix has an interesting origin story as well, for he served in the U.S. Army in an airborne special division at Fort Campbell and was released after a year for being a poor soldier. I don't think I've ever heard of that ever happening, but it may, if you're that bad of a soldier, one, why would you get admitted into the Army in the first place? But two, they wouldn't keep you around, I guess, if you were a poor soldier. But he was part of a special division, and why else would he be released other than to wreak his magic upon the world? A funny aside in the book is that a lot of people in that time, to avoid the draft, was faking being gay, like just being because I guess gay people aren't allowed in the Army, or weren't allowed in the Army, and they would fake being gay. But a big point is that none of these Laurel Canyon guys got drafted into the Army. Another thing I found out through John Todd Collins, who has a famous documentaries on YouTube about being born into witchcraft and being a big figure in the Council of 13. He was basically, through his family bloodline, was given a chunk, like a region of California to govern over, and he became a born-again Christian, supposedly, and exposed the stuff he says in his testimonies are insane, which I'll add a link to in the description. But his tie with this is he was best friends with David Crosby, had multiple connections within the scene of music. He owned Zodiac Record Production. So he owned a record company, a production company, which all ties into this whole big web of insanity. Jimi Hendrix was an interesting example of someone who was dropped from the Army for a ridiculous reason. Canned Heat singer, suicided, and lived in Laurel next to Joni Mitchell. Todd Collins, or Lance Collins was his occult name, is relevant to bring up as well, because Judy Collins, who is a key figure, who I don't know if it's related, but it was just interesting when I was reading the book, how this Judy Collins wrote songs for the Turtles, who are also a Laurel Canyon band. Cousins of the singer of the Turtles was Herb Cohen, Frank Zappa's manager. And Judy Collins wrote songs for the Turtles as well as other bands after a life of drugs and prostitution. So she was a prostitute and ended up writing songs for the Turtles. She had heavy Rosicrucian, Crowley, tarot influences. A lot of these bands, such as the Beatles, mention Aleister Crowley, the famed occultist and wizard, being a key influence in their songwriting, like the playing backwards and having unconscious messages while listening to something completely different. The Stairway to Heaven, the Paul is Bloody stuff. There's a documentary called The Black Beetle that I don't know if it's still on YouTube, but I'll try to find it and post a link. But that was a big one when I was in high school. My good friend Connor showed it to me. Funny enough, Paul McCartney was in the scene auditioning members for Badfinger, which was a pretty popular band at the time. and made their come-up song, wrote it, auditioned all the members for whatever tailored reason he had, and Ham of Badfinger was found swinging from the end of a rope. So that's what came of Badfinger. Bobby Beausoleil, attached to the Manson murders, and Tex Watson, the whole family, they worked in Benedict Canyon together, created the Lucifer Rising movie, which is really popular among occultists, and it's very, I haven't seen it personally, but it's a very popular one, and Bobby Beausoleil actually made the soundtrack inside of a prison cell, a popular story, and it was a tribute to Aleister Crowley. Beausoleil became in cahoots with this man, Donald Cammell, who was a friend of Roman Polanski's and a master manipulator, and also created a movie called Invocation of My Demon Brother. And they worked together on Lucifer Rising, Donald Cammell and Beausoleil. Son of Richard Cammell, who was close friend and biographer of Aleister Crowley. And he believed he was actually Crowley's godson, so felt obligated to make these Luciferic, satanic movies, which these occult movies explain or attempt to explain things and versions of evil that aren't really evil. It comes to a perspective thing, which I've struggled with myself. Evil is what you see it as, but they use this type of energy to coax one into dropping their moral standards and seeing things from a light that just doesn't feel right. So these people are operating with magic and operating on an unknowing public, a public that thinks these people mean good intentions when a lot of them do not, because they're serving a higher power that demands blood and hate and anger, Kenneth anger. And interesting enough, this Donald Cammell fellow wanted Marlon Brando, none other than Marlon Brando, the Godfather, to star in Lucifer Rising, but used someone else instead, probably to not completely change Marlon Brando's image, because Hollywood and Laurel Canyon has a plan for him. And that brings us into All the Young Turks, which I didn't even know of until I read this book. And that includes people like Dennis Hopper, Jack Nicholson, Marlon Brando, James Dean. They were all boys in Laurel Canyon. And believe it or not, this one's gonna sting. Apparently, James Dean and co-star and Rebel with a Cause's Adams were supposedly gay prostitutes before their movie career. So that explains partly why James Dean became such a figure early on, and why it was him rather than anybody else. I know that one's hard to swallow, but it puts it in an interesting perspective, knowing that these people have been groomed from the streets and they're chosen for a specific role due to their family backgrounds or what have you. And with that cliffhanger, I'm going to end part 2 here. But in the next part, I'm going into Jack Nicholson, Dennis Hopper, and shifting a little farther into the modern era. But I'm just trying to keep them short and to the point. Thank you.